Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 94 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. As I'm recording this, it's August 4th, and that means the Let's Talk Yoga podcast turns 2 today. I am so excited that we are celebrating 2 years of having this podcast out in the world. If I'm being honest, I did not think we would get to this milestone of 2 years and almost 100 episodes in and hundreds and thousands of downloads. When I just pause and think about it, my initial thought was, I'm going to put these episodes out, and if it's terrible, I'm just going to delete it off the face of the internet and no one will ever know. So just wanted to take a moment to thank all the listeners. Okay. I know there are many of you who have been with this podcast since the start and who continue to support and listen to the podcast week on week and continue to invest in your journey in yoga. And I also know there are so many new listeners who are, catching up with all the episodes. And I see your messages on Instagram, and it really warms my heart that you take a little extra time to come and tell me how much the podcast is of impact in your yoga life. So thank you. Thank you for the support. I do not take it for granted, and I am deeply, deeply grateful. Okay. I also want to take a moment to just acknowledge all the guests, especially our repeat guests who keep coming back on the show and who give wholeheartedly and who are so selfless in their knowledge sharing and their wisdom and their kindness. And anytime I ask some of my repeat guests if they want to come, they only have one answer, and that is yes. I'm so grateful that they are continuing to come and share on this podcast. Okay. Speaking of guests, we're talking to Dr. Kavitha Chinnanaiyan today, and we're exploring the topic of Tantra. Tantra as a subject has been on my mind for a while for the podcast. I'm not a Tantra expert. I don't know much about it. And it takes me a while to find the appropriate guest. So when you hear it, this conversation hopefully will really enrich you. Now, Dr. Kavitha is the perfect person to talk to about Tantra. She's a cardiologist and a professor of medicine, a wife and a mother. She's also published more than 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals, several book chapters. She serves on several national and international committees and organizations in the field of cardiology. But she has this other side and this other life, which is what we highlight in today's conversation. She's a Sri Vidya initiate and a disciple of Sri Chaitanya Nandanatha Saraswati, Pithadipati, and the founder of the Rajarajeshwari Pitham in Rush, New York. She's a longtime student of Dr. Sumit Kesarkar, who is her Vidya Guru in all traditions and encouraged her to set up her Shabda Institute. I have linked to her institute in the show notes today, which you can find at letstalk.yoga. She studied Advaita Vedanta at the Chinmaya Mission and a whole bunch of other teachers, including the Direct Path with Greg Gode, Sri Vidya with Sri Shiva Premananda, and Non-Dual Shaiva Tantra with Paul Muller Ortega and Sally Kempton. She's also the author of Shakti Rising, which has won the Natalis Gold Award for the best books of 2017, The Heart of Wellness, and Glorious Alchemy, Living the Lalita Sahasranama, and Fractals of Reality, which she talks about in the show today, which is her latest book that came out this year. Okay. Needless to say, she is highly, highly qualified. In fact, overqualified for this conversation. We break down Tantra for beginners. I wanted to set the stage for what is Tantra in this episode. So hopefully we can have more conversations unpacking what Tantra is all about. When you listen to today's podcast, you will understand the meaning of Tantra, what Tantra is essentially, and how it relates to yoga, and where does yoga and Tantra intersect, and what are some of the most popular misconceptions about Tantra. Because whenever in America, or at least the Western world, we think of Tantra, we're immediately thinking of tantric sex and sensual pleasure. And I bring that up in today's conversation. And Dr. Kavitha really elaborates so eloquently what Tantra is, the misconceptions, and what are the practices under Tantra, and so much more. So I really hope you find this conversation enriching. And if you want to connect with Dr. Kavitha, I have linked to her institute and all the work she does, including her books. They're available in the show notes at letstalk.yoga. So before I let you go and listen to this week's interview, just wanted to take a moment to remind you that if you have been here for even a few weeks or a couple of years and you haven't left us a review, consider it a birthday present for the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I would be deeply grateful if you could leave us a review and help us get this type of free yoga content into the hands of more yoga students. As always, enjoy the show. I'll see you on the other side. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a 6-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Kavitha. Welcome to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me on this show. It's wonderful to be here.
I want to just say something to the listeners before we get into our conversation about Tantra. I've said this before we started recording, you are overqualified for this conversation. There is so much that you have done and studied and put out into the world. And I'm hoping that this conversation that we're going to have together will set the stage. And it's the first time, Kavitha, that we're talking about Tantra on the show. So it will probably be a very new topic for a lot of listeners.
Okay.
So to kick things
off, I'm adequately warned.
So to kick things off, can we start right at the basics? What does the word Tantra actually mean?
That's a great place to start. And there are many different definitions for the word Tantra. But when you want to look at it from an etymological standpoint, it comes from two roots, Tanoti and Trayoti. Mm-hmm. And together they mean the instrument for expansion. And it specifically refers to the expansion of the nature of reality through the use of a particular view, particular practices, the use of a very specific means of a code of living, a code of being, all of which really refers to the ability to expand from this limited sense of self into a much more expanded vision and an expanded way of being, to understand myself as something more than this limited being. And from another standpoint, which I like because it's so poetic and very sweet, is Tantra actually also means to weave. And when you look at, if you were to think of all of creation as a humongous fabric with infinite patterns, then you can think of yourself or myself or any one of us as, tiny little specks of pattern within this grand scheme of this fabric. Mm-hmm. And Tantra is the way in which we can pull at this particular fabric that is me, and pull it in such a way that it expands and takes us into this greater weave. So you basically unweave yourself in order to weave yourself into the greater reality. And you go from being this, particular speck that is bound in time and space to one that goes beyond the confines of time and space, to understand myself as much more than what I thought I was. So it's a very beautiful way of looking at Tantra, and specifically on that issue of pulling at a particular thread. And that becomes relevant as we talk more about Tantra.
So if I were to ask you to define Tantra, what would that be?
So If you were to say, okay, what then is it? Well, it is a system. It is a set of, or rather, a system that consists of a set of different compartments. One that is philosophy and a particular view of how the world is, how creation is, and what that means for me. Who am I in the grand scheme of things? So that is the view. That is the philosophy. There is usually cosmogony, which is how the creation has come to be. And that is very relevant for me because that also reflects on how I've come to be. So all that is part of the philosophy and the darshana, or the view. And the darshana then defines the practice. So the practice here would be, how do I achieve what this philosophy is saying the worldview is? So then there is the compartment of practices. And then there is the compartment of the way of being, or achara, or the code of conduct. How should I be as someone that practices Tantra? How should I behave? How should I behave with myself? How should I behave with the world? Because my behavior is going to be impacted by this worldview that I'm going to take on from the philosophy compartment. It's also going to be influenced by the practices I take from the practice compartment. And this way of being is really the application of the view and the practice in daily life. So if you ask, what is Tantra? It is like yoga. Yoga has its vision, its view, it has its practices, it's a way of being. And so it is for Tantra. And so it is for any tradition, actually. In every tradition, we must remember that the fruit of the practice, whatever you are doing, the fruit of the practice is determined by the view of the practice and the goal of the practice. You have to be very, very clear about the view, because you can't have a kind of a vague or abstract understanding of the view, because not all practices in every tradition will get you to the same view. The practice and the living of a tradition will take you to that view. And therefore, it's really important to understand the worldview of the particular system that you are following. And so you can say Tantra is such a system. It's a comprehensive system of living life and coming to terms with this expanded understanding of reality, which is its specific worldview.
Because we have a lot of yoga teachers listening to this podcast, I want to circle back to yoga and Tantra. Is Tantra a part of yoga, or are they two completely separate paths altogether?
So to answer this question, we really need to get back a little bit into the history of yoga and of Tantra. Because when we don't understand the historical roots of these things, it can become very confusing. So when you look at the history of yoga, it spans many millennia, right? When you're talking about the Vedic age, which is 1500 or older BC, and then coming into the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Bhagavad Gita, and then coming into, and then also during that time are the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. So all of these texts and how this tradition has evolved and what was the purpose of it. So for that, you have to really understand where did it begin, right? And if you look at the earliest kinds of understanding of this worldview, it is that we have these five senses. Here is my human experience. My human experience is influenced by what I take in from my five senses. This is very clear, right, to all of us, even now. It doesn't matter which age. So it's very clear that my experience is influenced by what I take in from the world through my five senses. And as we start looking at our experience, and this is what happened back then, is wait a minute. Now, if my joy and my suffering comes from this world of experience that is coming in through my five senses, is there something I can do to block that, to control the inflow of information? So this is what we see in that Vedic and the pre-Vedic periods in terms of yoga, which is, how do I influence what comes in through my senses? So can I control my senses? So when you see, the earliest descriptions of yoga, for instance, and a lot of work has been done in this field by many, many scholars, when you thought about yoga, it was really about sense control. So you had, yogis sitting in absolutely unmoving positions, putting themselves through rigorous austerities, simply to understand, can I control my experience of the world that is coming in through the senses? As in, can I just block out my senses? And so you have the description of tapas, for instance, in these older texts, where you're standing in the middle of fire, you're just standing in one posture until your limb atrophies, and you're putting yourself in difficult positions simply to understand the concept of pleasure and pain, and what I want and what I don't want, attractions and aversions, and so on. And so that was the premise of yoga right in the very beginning. And then, when you start to look at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, for instance, a lot of it also has to do with renunciation. Renunciation of the world is really the definition of yoga in a lot of those earlier texts, where you become so internalized, the world does not influence you. And you've really said, okay, I don't want to have anything to do with the world. I don't want to have any of these sensory inputs. I just want to absorb into a higher reality within myself. And so this is the premise of yoga. And then, as we start seeing the development of the Puranas, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Bhagavad Gita at about, 150 BC, around then, is when we start to see that there is a difference. Actually, there is now a change in the way yoga is defined, because here is the text of the Bhagavad Gita saying yoga is not about renunciation like that. It is renunciation in action. So suddenly we start getting a whole bunch of different definitions of yoga, including, karma yoga and bhakti yoga and so on. But ultimately, the idea of renunciation is really important when we want to consider the development of Tantra, because with the Vedic traditions, there is also the development simultaneously of the Brahmanical traditions. Now, I'm sure you know what this means. The Brahmanical traditions are, the development of the four castes or the four divisions of society, where one division is much more dominant in terms of being superior in society, in terms of being the most deserving of the heavens, so to speak. And so there is a dominance that occurs in the Brahmanical traditions, along with the development of the rites of purity. And the reason I'm telling you all this is all of this is really important in understanding how Tantra came to me. Because if we don't understand this, then, the cultural context is so important in understanding this, right? So the Brahmanical traditions, with its rites of purity, the rituals of purity, really gave rise or made it possible, made the ground fertile for the development of Tantra. And this was already within the context of, yoga was already a renunciatory kind of a path. And then there was this Vedic tradition with the Brahmanical kind of dominance of purity and the caste system and who is eligible and who isn't eligible. And within this context arises this, a kind of revolutionary system that says, actually, I don't need to do all that. I am capable of expansion as long as I have been initiated by somebody in that tradition. So the whole concept of diksha or initiation in Tantra comes from here, is that when you get diksha, you don't belong to any caste. All of the caste issues dissolve when you get diksha or this initiation, and you become eligible for the practice of Tantra, regardless of who you are. So Tantra now develops in the context of, number one, the background of renunciation that is going on with yoga. Number two, this hierarchical thing that's going on with the Brahmanical traditions. And it comes in as an opposition to both and says, well, can I have my cake and eat it too? Essentially, that's the question, right? And say, do I really need to renounce? Is it even possible for me to renounce my senses? Do I have to give up the world? Can I not be a householder? Is it possible for me to have this freedom that is promised by the view of the Vedas, but can I also enjoy the world along with it? Because yoga said, enjoyment is a problem. You should just give up all this enjoyment and become a renunciate. And Tantra came in to say, well, you can renounce, and the renunciation is not a physical one, that you can have what is known as bhukti and mukti, which is you can enjoy this play of creation, of consciousness, of the world, and yet be free from it. So it developed kind of in that parameter and then became much more sophisticated and specialized and so on. So to answer your question, is Tantra different than yoga? Historically, yes. But what has happened with Tantra is there has been absolutely no Eastern tradition that has not been touched by Tantra since its development. It has become ubiquitous. Like even if you did a simple Anjali Mudra, that is a tantric thing. The issue of mudras and of course there were Vedic mantras before, but the way we think of mantras now, the bija mantras and the way we practice mantras, mandalas, yantras, everything that is part of, many mainstream Eastern traditions is really tantric. So there has been no Eastern tradition that hasn't been influenced by Tantra in one way or another. So even when people are thinking that they are not really interested or they are not doing anything in Tantra, the minute you actually do certain kinds of rituals and so on, those elements are already tantric.
That was really, so clear, but brings up a couple of questions for me. What would be some of the practices that come under Tantra? And then I want to get into some of the misconceptions, but I'll wait for that.
Absolutely. So what are the practices? Now, in a very simplistic way, Tantra is the understanding of yantra and mantra. Okay, this is a very simplistic understanding or simplistic way of saying what encompasses tantric practices. So remember I said Tantra is the instrument of expansion. So for the instrument of expansion, for it to be an instrument of expansion, it can work in many different ways. One way to work with that is through mantra. Mantra is a sound, and there are many nuances of mantra, which I won't go into, but mantra essentially means sound. And the sound is what is used to expand the mind beyond its own confines. Now, what is the basis of that? The basis of that is this fundamental understanding in Tantra that all of creation is made up of energy and vibration. So it's not that different than saying, in the beginning, there was the Word was with God, and then the Word is God. So it's a similar concept here where everything arises as a result of shabda or sound. And all of the different energies we have in creation are forms of that shabda or sound. It's basically the sound energy that is condensed and rarefied and vibrates and scintillates and dances in infinite forms. And so the mantra is a particular vibration that takes us from the most condensed, most gross form of existence to the most rarefied, the most higher, the most subtle form of the divine. So the fundamental viewpoint here is that here is the divine, supreme divine, or the highest reality. This highest reality then in loops and loops and loops of condensation of this vibration becomes the infinite forms of creation. And when we use the mantra, we are going from this most condensed, limited form back to that unlimited divine. So that is the use of mantra. Now, a visual representation of the same thing comes from a yantra such as the Shri Chakra or the Shri Yantra, or any different, any of the infinite yantras there are associated with all these deities. It's the same principle. There is a visual representation of that. There is the sound representation of that. And both of those are used in specific ways in tantric sadhana or in tantric practice. There are other tantric practices such as nyasa, which is the ritual placement of the deities within one's own body and mind. There are rituals and there are pujas, for instance. And one of the most important and central concepts of Tantra is the relationship with the Guru. In Tantra, the Guru, the deity, and the practitioner are one. And to understand the oneness of these three entities is one of the primary goals of the tantric practice. So the Guru is extremely, and maybe not even extremely important. The Guru is the thing in Tantra, is the central, theme or the central principle of Tantra. And the Guru is the one that takes one through the nuances of practice. And eventually the practitioner arrives at the understanding that what I'm seeking is really already within me, and that is the Guru and the deity and myself are all the same. So what I'm worshiping there, what I'm thinking is there, is actually the one doing this. That whole thing, of the Guru, the practices, the view, all of these are different aspects of tantric practice.
Got it. We've actually highlighted many times over on the show the importance of a guru and a teacher in your life in yoga. So I completely understand how you speak about the guru being central to the journey when you're starting Tantra. Another thing we notice, at least in modern popular yoga, is there's a lot of self-navigation and Google becomes your teacher somehow, and it leads to so much of confusion. So that brings me to my next question. What have we fundamentally misunderstood about Tantra in popular yoga? Because when I think of Tantra, I'm forced to think of, sex and sensual pleasure, and that's because it's been highlighted in mainstream media. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very important question. So remember how in the beginning I said, if you look at Tantra as a way of weaving, where you can pull on a thread. So one of the aphorisms of Tantra, which is beautiful, is that the path through which you fall is the path through which you rise. In other words, our very limitations, my very contractions and my very limitations become the pathway to expansion.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say this instrument of expansion, what is this instrument of expansion? It's not something that's out there. It's what is immediately available to me, which is my own contraction, my own ideas about myself, my self-image, my, my posturing when I'm relating with the world or relating to others. And there are infinite possibilities infinite ways in which we are contracted on a moment-to-moment basis. And each can become a thread that we can pull at. So this is the beauty of Tantra, where it says, whatever your problem is, that can become the gateway to your freedom. And from that standpoint, if you look at some of the things that are banned or really strongly discouraged in other traditions, they become these pathways to freedom. And they are called panchamakaras. Panchamakaras. Pancha means 5. Makara means something that begins with the syllable ma. And there are 5 such things that are described in these texts. Actually, there are 3, and then 2 are added later. The first of which is eating meat. So if you look at a lot of lineages, particularly the Vaishnava traditions and so on, there is a lot of emphasis on not eating meat. That, if you are a practitioner, you should be vegetarian. That is, it's just a given. And again, this is why the cultural context is so important, right? Because if you come to this from a Judeo-Christian perspective, you're like, what's the big deal about eating meat?
Mm-hmm. So
there
true.
is no big deal.
So true.
Right? So this cultural context is very important. So when you look at the Brahmanical traditions, eating meat was a big no-no, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so so what the Tantrikas said is, well, okay, we can see why that can be a problem, but can this become a pathway to freedom where I am imbibing this particular substance? And can this very substance that is supposedly taking me to hell, can it take me to freedom? Can I become free of it? And so these substances like, alcohol, fish, meat, mudra, which is, grains, or, mudra is interpreted in either as grains, dried grains, which are aphrodisiac, or, the hand gestures I was talking about. Mm-hmm. And finally, maithuna. Mm-hmm. Maithuna is sex. Now, why is, sex such a big thing? Because, again, think about the context in which this developed. The Brahmanical traditions, they're very, very moralistic and very judgmental, right? You can only do this, and this is what is subscribed and prescribed for you, and beyond this you can't. It's a sin. Mm-hmm. So the Tantrikas said, well, I want to go beyond these moral and social and cultural norms, because if I am a good practitioner and sticking within the norms of society, then am I really free? Because true freedom is freedom beyond all norms. So whatever is prescribed, do I have it within me to rise above that, not as rebellion, but as an expansion of my own awareness? So when they started exploring with these panchamakaras, it's very important to emphasize for me here that this was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of exploration to see, can I expand beyond my own confines of what is sin and what is virtue and how this binds me in something. Mm-hmm. So it was not to show anybody. It was not to prove anything. It was not to prolong enjoyment. It was simply to understand, can I expand beyond my own limitations? Mm-hmm. And so by the way, not all tantric traditions have this. Not all tantric traditions prescribe the panchamakaras. Many tantric traditions still say absolutely no. It all depends on, and within a particular sampradaya or a particular lineage, the guru may say, this is appropriate for you, but it's not appropriate for you.
Got it.
The guru can decide who should be doing what. So it all depends on where one is stuck, right? Now take this as an example. Say you come from a tradition where you were highly repressed and you weren't really allowed sexual freedom. And then you say, well, here is Tantra. And here I can do whatever. And then you basically come here and you say, well, what you're doing is you're appropriating the tantric tradition to suit your own needs. That's not what Tantra is. Just because your tradition didn't allow something, you can't just take something from a culture that without knowing its background or understanding what the purpose is and try to apply it. Because then what happens is you're just, the fundamental thing that needs to change is this mass of the subconscious mind with all of its, justifications and validations and, the mass of things that keep us bound, right? Nothing is changing if you just go from one to the other because it's convenient. So the very thing for which it was intended, it's not going to work. You see? So that appropriation is really important. And so is there a sexual component in Tantra? Yes, in some tantric lineages. Yes, not all of Tantra. Is Tantra only about sex? Absolutely, unequivocally not. So does it clarify it?
It does. And I really like how you emphasize that it is not a rebellion and it is about expanding your own awareness and your own consciousness. I think that is very important, and how not to pluck something from another tradition because something was off in yours and you couldn't express yourself in a certain way.
Exactly.
And I'm so glad you mentioned all of this because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking that's why you need your guru to navigate through this journey.
Oh, yes. My gosh, yes.
So
because we are so prone to self-deception.
It is true. And our ego also gets, tangled in all of this. And so my question would be, how do we understand desire then? What would qualify as authentic desire and something that is a little more ego-driven? I don't even know if this is a good question, but I'm hoping you're able to understand.
Yeah. It's a great question because I think you have heard, and I'm sure many of your listeners have heard, that Tantra is the path of desire. And so it becomes really relevant to talk about that. See, the thing is, everything in life is driven by desire. There is no life without desire, right? Creation itself occurs because of desire. And you can't get out of bed if you don't desire to do so. What can we possibly do without desire, right? Desire is the driver, right? It's the creative energy of life. And so it is in tantric traditions. Ichha Shakti is the primal Shakti. And without Ichha Shakti, there is no Jnana Shakti or Kriya Shakti. So Ichha is everything. Now, what do we do with desire? And here there is a huge emphasis in Tantra on transmutation of desire. So it's not to curb desire. It's not to bypass it. It's not to explain it away, but to actually open to it and transmute it. And how do we transmute it? Through devotion, through understanding this particular view. But actually, this devotion is it's a very integral part of Tantra. And if you see all of these tantric lineages, right, they are all centered around various deities. So if you see the Shaiva traditions, the central deity is Shiva. If you look at Shakta traditions, the central deity is Shakti. And then there is the Ganapati tantric sects with an emphasis on Ganapati or Vishnu. And so there are all these different tantric traditions. And it's not just Hindu Tantra, right? If you see even Buddhist Tantra, there in Vajrayana, for instance, there is devotion to the mandala of the guru and of the various deities of that mandala is very much emphasized. The whole point of having these deities, this higher ideal, is for the transmutation of desire. That I can take my ordinary desire for this or that, and I can transmute it into a desire for this ideal that I want to achieve, this ideal where I want to arrive at. And so devotion and surrender become really, really important in this transmutation of desire. So desire is extremely important. We have to harness its energy because, and I know this even from my own personal practice, that the energy of the desire is the driving force for practice as well as progress in any sadhana, actually, not just tantric sadhana, even yogic sadhana. It's really important to do that.
So I'm just pausing because I was just thinking there are so many questions I want to ask you, but I want to be respectful of your time. So if someone is listening to this and they are like, I want to start exploring Tantra a lot more, where would they start? Because I feel like there is so much of misinformation available outside that it can actually be hard to navigate. And from conversations with a lot of listeners, I know they don't find teachers easily. So where would you guide someone to get started on understanding Tantra holistically?
Yeah, I think there are many people doing great work in this field and really putting authentic tantric teachings out there. And that is certainly something that I try to do as well. So, my books are one thing that I would recommend. Actually, there is my new book, which is on fractals of reality, which is on the Sri Chakra or the Sri Yantra, is really all about this tantric sadhana and all the nuances of tantric sadhana. But it may be a bit much for somebody who's just starting. And on my course platform, I have a course known as Foundations of Non-Dual Tantra. And it's just 4 lessons of really exploring what non-dual Tantra is and the history and the various aspects of it. And there are other people doing the same thing. So really getting into, the first thing I would suggest is if somebody is interested in Tantra, the first thing to do is really become exclusively interested in it. As in, get into it, learn more about it, take a course, read a book, read the right kinds of things, take a course, and then understand whether, or really explore whether that's what you want to do, if that's the path you want to go into. And because it sounds really sexy, but working with a teacher is not something that everybody's prepared to do. And I can tell you that right off the bat. Because putting aside our individuality, which we really struggle very hard to cultivate a lot of times, is very difficult for us. And in tantric sadhana, in authentic tantric sadhana, that's actually non-negotiable. Working with a teacher is really non-negotiable. And I have found this myself, actually. Not a day goes by where I'm completely not melting from the grace of my gurus, because without their grace, I would be so blind and deluded to a lot of my own patterns, And so working with somebody and the willingness to work with somebody is, I would say, the top 3 criteria. And then comes the, everything else can be arranged after that. But the willingness to work with somebody is the most important thing.
I have been reading your blogs and I'm looking forward to reading your books as well. I'm really glad you came on the show to talk about Tantra. I know there is a lot we have not yet touched on, but that's the nature of conversations like this. I would love for you to share where the listeners can connect with you directly, and I'll also add everything in the show notes.
Absolutely. Yes. So the website, my website is shabda.institute, sabda.institute. And that's where, you'll find everything that we do from the Shabda Institute. And everything is
Wonderful.
there.
Thank you so much, Kavitha. I am so glad you are here, and I hope we can have more conversations like this in future.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on the show, Arundhati. It's been beautiful talking with you.
As always, thank you for listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. You can find all the show notes at letstalk.yoga/listen. Please remember to rate and review the Let's Talk Yoga podcast, and I will see you next week. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.